Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're objectively unpacking a very specific proposed Republican midterm strategy. This blueprint comes to us from conservative commentator Victor Davis Hanson, and we'll also be looking at a related advocacy campaign by the Alliance Defending Freedom. Our main goal here? To really understand the nuts and bolts of this political playbook, completely regardless of where you might sit on the political spectrum. Let's get right into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to break down this strategy pillar by pillar. We'll start with the midterm challenge, move into a proposed Republican contract, look at how they defend their record and critique the left, and finally, we'll wrap up by analyzing that ADF campaign. All right, Section 1, the midterm challenge. We're looking at historical hurdles and current polling. So Hanson kicks things off by diagnosing a pretty massive, immediate mathematical problem for the Republican Party. Get this. In 39 out of the last 41 midterm elections, the party holding the White House has lost seats. When you combine that historical reality with already incredibly thin House margins, well, it creates a very serious headwind. It's an uphill battle right out of the gate. And this perfectly illustrates why Hanson believes Democrats are so optimistic right now. He points to generic polls showing them with a solid 5 to 6% lead, which is set against a roughly 40% polling average for Donald Trump. So again, he's really painting a picture of a steep uphill climb for Republicans. Now, according to Hanson, the current Republican counterstrategy is relying way too heavily on unpredictable variables. We're talking about wild cards like unexpected actions by Donald Trump, sudden drops in global gas prices, favorable Supreme Court rulings on racial gerrymandering, controversial quotes from Democratic socialists, or just banking on superior PAC and Trump campaign funding. Basically, Hanson argues that just crossing your fingers and hoping for these random events to fall your way, that's simply not a viable substitute for a cohesive, proactive strategy. That brings us to Section 2, a new Republican contract, where Hanson proposes a specific legislative agenda. To counter that passive approach we just talked about, Hanson proposes what he calls a new contract with America. Instead of just criticizing opponents, he wants the party to run on some very strict, specific action items. We're talking about aggressively closing the border and deporting those here illegally, especially criminals. He wants to hold bureaucracies and universities accountable for DEI bias, start taxing remittances sent out of the U.S. at 1%, continue expanding fossil fuel and natural gas production, and tackle the national debt by freezing federal spending and reviewing entitlements. He places a huge, massive emphasis on that last point about the national debt, really framing it as an existential crisis for the country. He explicitly warns that the debt is increasing geometrically, not arithmetically, and is approaching a staggering $40 trillion. To put that into perspective, he notes the daily interest alone now exceeds $1 billion every single day. That's a figure that actually eclipses the entire defense budget. Moving on to Section 3, defending the record, focusing on highlighting claimed past successes. So the next step in Hanson's playbook requires Republicans to aggressively defend and promote their past administrative record, and to do it using very specific metrics. For instance, he looks at inflation, claiming his preferred administration maintained a highly controlled 1.9% average during its first term. He contrasts this directly against a 5.1% average under prior leadership, using this to argue that affordability was managed much better. The strategy also leans heavily on crime statistics, specifically citing a massive 70% drop to historic lows in certain areas. A prime example he points to is the deployment of federal troops in Washington, D.C. to work alongside local police. Hanson argues this specific action successfully cleaned up the streets, restored monuments, and made the Capitol highly secure at the time. Now, take a look at how the border issue is framed here. It's presented as a very sharp zero-sum contrast. Hanson presents the past conservative record as a functionally closed border, boasting 99% legal crossings and strictly lawful human deportations. And he positions this directly against the Biden administration, which he characterizes as overseeing an influx of 10 to 12 million people arriving without audits or required vaccinations. On the geopolitical front, his playbook claims a pretty massive shift occurred in Latin America and the Caribbean. His argument is that while 75% of these countries were heading left during the Obama era, almost all of them were subsequently pushed to become pro-American and conservative under Republican leadership. All right, Section 4, Critiquing the Left, where we look at how he suggests framing the ideological opponent. After laying out policy goals and defending the record, Hanson's strategy pivots hard to attacking the political opponent, and he hones right in on the concept of socialism. He explicitly defines socialism as basically a euphemism for totalitarianism. He cites historical examples like the USSR and Nazi Germany to argue that modern socialists inherently, inevitably resort to authoritarianism the very moment their elected leaders encounter any sort of political resistance. Because of this framing, he advises Republicans to completely dismantle the narrative that progressives represent the working class. Instead, his strategy is to reframe the modern left entirely, labeling them as a party of downwardly mobile, college-educated elites and immigrants from failed states. He even goes so far as to claim they view the American public as essentially just lab rats. To really cement this framing, he lists out some specific progressive figures to allege a massive hypocrisy between their socialist rhetoric and their actual personal wealth. For instance, he calls out commentator Hassan Piker as a multimillionaire driving a Porsche. He points to politician Zoran Mamdani as hailing from the 1% in Uganda, mentions Ro Khanna's family trust funds, golf courses, and $200,000 Range Rover, and points to Ilhan Omar, who he claims is worth $30 million. That brings us to our final part, Section 5. The ADF Advocacy Campaign, looking at legal action in high school sports. So how do these types of cultural critiques translate into real-world political messaging? Well, the source material abruptly pivots here to an advocacy campaign from the Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF for short. They lay out a very specific timeline of events in Washington state centered around policies regarding biological males competing in girls' sports. The ADF details the case of high school sophomore Callie Keeler, stating she was sexually assaulted on a wrestling mat during a tournament and that she only learned post-match that her opponent was a biological male identifying as a girl. Now, the ADF is officially assisting Keeler in suing the state over its gender policy. The ADF is actively using this case to solicit donations and fight against policies that they argue prioritize gender ideology over the safety and informed consent of female athletes. As you can see from their quote here, they are heavily criticizing rules that not only allow males to compete in girls' sports, but that don't even require schools to disclose that biological information to the female athletes or their parents beforehand. So, what does this all mean for the midterms? As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. If elections are truly decided by which side successfully dictates the narrative, does Hanson's highly structured, aggressive combination of statistical claims, strict ideological framing, and intense cultural advocacy provide the exact blueprint Republicans need? Or does a playbook this aggressive risk alienating the very moderate voters they absolutely need to overcome those daunting historical odds we talked about at the start? It's a fascinating strategic question. Thanks so much for exploring this source material with me today.